Thank you, Mike. Yeah, we'll get to the stay-at-home dad thing. When my father and his sister were growing up in rural Illinois, they used to play this game when they were done with their chores and didn't have anything else to do. And they would go out into a field and they would find a rabbit, which you didn't have to walk very far. The rabbit would run, they would chase it. And then, invariably, they'd run across another rabbit. They'd change direction, chase the new rabbit. They do that until they were worn out. Sometimes they ended up someplace kind of interesting. That became a metaphor for conversation in my family ever since. Chasing rabbits is what we call conversations where you start on one topic and you go in a different direction, and then you go in a different direction, you go in a different direction, and sometimes you end up someplace kind of interesting. This is going to be one of those talks. I'm a little nervous, so I'm going to start with a very personal confession. I am a compulsive thief. I get it from my family. I have an itch to take things that are beautiful and useful. I'm a maker. I make things, so beautiful and useful are the same thing. My dad did the same thing. His workshop was full of things that he had found or cannibalized. That's really the saving grace, is that the stuff that I steal is almost always garbage. One time we were driving around, and he was known for stopping on the side of the road to pick up tools and things. And we drove by a wrench, and I was about 12 years old, I thought, oh, he missed it. He didn't see it. So I called out. I said, hey, Dad, did you see that wrench we drove by? Thinking that I had seen something he hadn't. He said, yeah, but I already have 3 of that size. He was somebody who would repair and remake. I inherited that. I worked for Verizon. I left voluntarily. I wasn't fired. But I would pull things out of the trash can, the dumpsters, the recycle bins. Most of the tools on my truck were rehabbed or rehabilitated in one way or another. I get my pilfering from my blood. I also get it from my training. I'm trained as an artist. A couple of years ago, I ran across this book title, and I saw these crosses that were on there, and I thought, that's beautiful. That's an idea. That's something that I want to steal. But I didn't have metal to be able to make it. What I did have on my work truck were these traffic cones, and I had one that was damaged beyond usability. The bottom of it is this thick material, and I thought, I could make a cross out of that. And then for the image, I thought of scrimshaw. So another idea that I appropriated. Scrimshaw is a method by which you inscribe into a material and then rub it with some dark material to bring the lines out. And what I ended up with was this, which is mine. And it's my interpretation of an Etruscan cross made out of the bottom of a traffic cone. Technically, that traffic cone still belonged to Verizon, even though it was trash. So I have the tendency to find things that are discarded and find uses for them. I'm trained as an artist. My pilfering comes from my training. This is Austin Kleon. He gave a talk in 2012 based on his book, Steal Like an Artist. He talks about his own work, taking newspaper clippings, pages from newspapers, blacking out most of the words, but leaving certain words behind that create certain interesting associations. When he started publishing these, he was told that his work was derivative because there was an artist from 30 years ago who had done the same thing. He researched that, found out there was an artist from 30 years before that who had done something similar, and then somebody who had done something similar 200 years ago. And he realized that rather than feeling bad about the fact that he was stealing this idea for his art, he realized that art is theft, that art and the entire creative process is finding something that speaks to you and reinterpreting it, remixing it in a new way. So in addition to my training giving me my instincts for pilfering, I also get it from my generation. I'm Gen X. One of the defining characteristics of my generation is the mixtape. My prized position when I was 10 years old, I had saved up for a dual cassette deck that allowed me to steal music from the radio and then take out the songs that I wanted, and put them together into a separate mixtape that my friends and I would listen to. Not only is this a defining part of the generation in making our own mixtapes, it's a part of our generation in how we created music. Mark Ronson in 2014, he's a DJ and a music producer, he gave a TED Talk where he was talking about remixing and the cultural implications of remixing. I want to play, if I can, a little bit of his talk just for a second.
See, 30 years ago, you had the first digital samplers, and they changed everything overnight. All of a sudden, artists could sample from anything and everything that came before them. From a snare drum, from the Funky Meters, for a Ron Carter bass line, the theme to The Price is Right. Albums like De La Soul's 3 Feet High and Rising and the Beastie Boys' Paul's Boutique looted from decades of recorded music to create these sonic layered masterpieces that were basically the Sgt. Peppers of their day. And they weren't sampling these records because they were too lazy to write their own music. They weren't sampling these records to cash in on the familiarity of the original stuff. To be honest, it was all about sampling really obscure things, except for a few obvious exceptions like Vanilla Ice and Doon 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 that we know about. But the thing is, they were sampling those records because they heard something in that music that spoke to them, that they instantly wanted to inject themselves into the narrative of that music. They heard it, they wanted to be a part of it, and all of a sudden they found themselves in possession of the technology to do so. Not much unlike the way the Delta Blues struck a chord with the Stones and the Beatles and Clapton, and they felt the need to co-opt that music for the tools of their day. In music, we take something that we love and we build on it.
So taking something we love and building on it, right? That's my way of pilfering. That's my idea of theft. Kirby Ferguson in 2012 gave a talk that dealt with similar issues. He started with music, with Bob Dylan stealing from Woody Guthrie, who stole from the blues musicians before him. But Kirby Ferguson takes it into a very broad definition that all creativity is based on this idea of copying and transforming and then innovating. And that's the basis of all of the ideas. He talks about Henry Ford. He talks about Steve Jobs. He talks about remixing as the fundamental idea behind all of our creative endeavors. So I get it from my generation. I get it from my training. I also get my pilfering from my spiritual heritage. One of my favorite kinds of remixing is midrash. Midrash is a technique of spiritual interpretation and prophetic utterance where scholars would take scripture from the past and they would pull it into a contemporary context. They would add it to the things that were going on in their day. Sometimes they would transform meanings. Sometimes they would invert meanings. They were doing exactly what Mark was talking about by taking things that were sometimes obscure and bringing them into a different context. Midrash is all through our scriptures, all through Paul's letters. The book of Jude is essentially one massive midrash. My favorite midrash is in Matthew. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Matthew here is referencing John and referencing Isaiah. He's talking about John being the voice in the wilderness, calling out that God's kingdom is arriving on all of creation. But that's not actually what Isaiah said. What Isaiah said was a voice cries out, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Now granted, Greek and Hebrew didn't use punctuation the way we use it, right? They didn't have that. But you can see from the context that the voice is in civilization and the path that God is traveling is in the wilderness. So Matthew, pointing to John, pulls from Isaiah and inverts the meaning. Exactly the kind of remixing that Mark Ronson was talking about. And the thing that I love about midrash, which is also true in remixing, is that they are both true. They both speak to us. We can hear the message from Isaiah that even in civilization, even within our comfortable culture, we can point to the wilderness through which God is arriving. And also, we can be the voice in the wilderness saying that God's world is coming to all of creation. So wilderness is a tricky concept. We have a hard time, a love-hate relationship with wilderness, right? It's the place of refuge for David when he's fleeing from Saul. It's the place of escape for the Hebrews when they leave Egypt. But civilization is the land of milk and honey, right? We don't want to stay in the wilderness. We want to get to civilization and stay there. But God has a real affection for wilderness. It's where the prophets go to hear him. This is a sukkah, which is the traditional dwelling that's made during the festival of Sukkot. God loved wilderness so much that when he was establishing the festivals for the children of Israel, he commanded that once a year, for 7 days, they would build temporary structures that were open to the sky so that you could see the stars or be rained on. And that they would dwell in those dwellings for 7 days in order to remember that their ancestors had been homeless. This is a homeless encampment in Eugene, Oregon. I have an itch in my itch to pilfer and appropriate. I have an itch to spend Sukkot sometime in a homeless encampment. And that's appropriation on at least 3 different levels. I'm not Jewish. I'm not homeless. I don't have any right to do that festival in a place like this. But remixing is stealing. Creativity is theft. I am in the process now of building the kinds of relationships that I hope will get me to a place where I could be invited into one of those encampments for Sukkot, because I believe that that's what God was talking about when he was talking about Sukkot. The wilderness that we experience, that we are going to be looking to see God and to go into and call out, those aren't going to be physical wildernesses. They're going to be mental wildernesses. Jason from last year's Tim talked about rethinking the priesthood of all believers, reclaiming that message, reinterpreting how ministry is done in our congregations. That's a kind of wilderness. Having those kinds of conversations in our congregations is leaving civilization. It is a kind of organizational wilderness that he is calling us to. Mike, talking about pain and suffering, talking about looking at programs that are no longer effective or congregations that are no longer effective and bringing them to a place where they can be gracefully ended. Organizationally, that's a kind of wilderness. That is outside of our comfort zone. Bonnie, last year, talking about shame and suffering, talking about the fact that Jesus didn't just die for our sins, but he died for our shame. Conversations around shame are not comfortable conversations. If we talk about those things in our congregations, we are leaving civilization. We are going into a kind of wilderness. So here's my epiphany wish, my big idea, that we would go out from this place, having heard messages that challenge us, that we would look for the places that are outside of our comfort zone, that we would see where God is arriving through those. And like Isaiah, in our comfort, we would point to that wilderness as a place where God is arriving. And also, like John, referenced in Matthew, remixing Isaiah, that we would be in those places of wilderness and that we would call out that God's kingdom is arriving to all of creation. Thank you very much.